I'm Victoria, and this morning I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Beth DeSombre. Professor DeSombre is a professor of environmental studies at Wellesley. She received her BA from Oberlin College and her PhD from Harvard University. Professor DeSombre focuses on international environmental law, ocean and atmospheric issues, protection of the global commons, and environmental politics. She has published several books on these topics and is currently working on another book regarding global fisheries. Professor DeSombre is also involved in developing and teaching in the 3-College Sustainability Certificate Program, a collaborative effort between Wellesley, Olin, and Babson. Outside of academia, Professor DeSombre is a folk singer-songwriter. She has performed across New England and has released 2 CDs. Today, Professor DeSombre will be speaking to us about why good people do bad environmental things. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor DeSombre.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And this room is different than the last time I saw it. It's a lovely room. Thanks for having me. I know you have a lot of really interesting speakers, and I hope that what I say will be useful to you. I'll try to leave some time at the end for discussion and questions. I focus on environmental issues which are always relevant to whatever the Albright Institute is studying, and I know it's relevant to what you guys are studying. I would argue the environment is relevant to most human behavior and most issues that we're dealing with. And infrastructure is, in this, relevant to your context, a key part both of what can cause and what can prevent environmental problems. So that is going to, whatever piece of infrastructure you're working on this week, this month, I hope I have something that will be useful to you. So I'm going to start with the good news, which is that no one is trying to cause environmental problems. All else equal, most of us would rather prevent them, fix them, not cause them in the first place, and we would generally be happy to stop doing whatever behavior is causing environmental problems that we happen to be engaging in. The bad news is we're all, nevertheless, behaving in ways that are causing environmental problems, despite the fact that we don't intend to, we don't want to. Nobody's getting up in the morning and saying, hey, I'm going to deplete that fishery. I'm going to, cause the destruction of the ozone layer. This is not in anybody's goal set. But they are nevertheless acting in ways that cause environmental problems. And my general argument is that in order to understand how to fix, prevent, mitigate, address environmental problems, you need to actually understand why it makes sense that people are acting in ways that cause them. If you think it doesn't make sense, you think it should be really easy to solve environmental problems because all you have to do is explain to people why what they're doing doesn't make sense. But the problem is, there are good reasons that all of us, individually, collectively, societally, globally, are behaving in ways that cause environmental problems. So if we want to not cause them, if we want to fix them, if we want to prevent them, we need to understand why good people are nevertheless behaving in ways that cause environmental problems. Now, the simplistic version of the framework that I'm putting this in, I don't mean it to be quite as simplistic, but just as a starting point, we should be imagining a system of costs and benefits, and that for everything that we do, there are costs to what we're doing and there are benefits to what we're doing, and for the most part, if we are able to, we choose things that are going to have more benefits than costs. So we want to be thinking about how environment fits into that framework and why it is that it is more difficult, more costly often to do the right environmental thing. And so that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Now, the first thing, and I'm doing the low-tech version of the talk here, the first reason that good people do bad environmental things is that environmental problems are externalities. Externalities, there are a lot of different ways you could define them, but I like to think of them as unintended and unpriced consequences of something else that you're trying to do. Economists call them market failures, but it's actually a little bit broader than that, or it's useful to think about them a little bit more broadly than that. And in externalities, unintended, unpriced consequences can be positive or negative. So my neighbor really likes gardening and plants beautiful flowers, and she does it because she really likes gardening on her own, but I get to experience the beautiful flowers. That's a positive externality of her gardening. That's great. But that's not usually the sort of thing that we're thinking about. When we talk about environmental problems, we're usually thinking about negative externalities, the sort of downside of something that somebody's trying to do. And the other important thing to keep in mind about externalities is that they are reciprocal. There are always at least two parties to an externality. Somebody who is doing, planting flowers, and somebody else who is experiencing the positive or negative impact, unintended positive or negative impact of that behavior. The most important thing to think about when you're thinking about externalities is to ask what you're trying to accomplish when you are causing an environmental problem. So if I'm trying to make sure that on this reasonably dark, rainy New England January day, we can see in the classroom, and you can see what I write on the board, and the nice people who are videotaping me can actually see what I'm doing, we have turned on lights. And our intention here is for you to be able to see what's going on in this classroom. Our intention is not to cause global climate change, or if we were doing this in the Midwest, to cause acid rain by the way that our electricity is being provided. So acid rain or climate change are unintended consequences of a perfectly reasonable thing that we're trying to do. I want you to see what I am saying. In fact, we have all sorts of power here so that they can hear what I'm saying on the tape. Those are good goals, right? The Albright Institute is great. If I'm up here and you can't see me or you can't hear me, less useful. So we have a good plan. There's something that we're trying to accomplish that's useful. We're also, by the way, trying to keep ourselves warm, which is, it's a little chilly out there, less than it used to be. But, those are all perfectly reasonable things for us to want to do, and they have, nevertheless, unintended environmental consequences because of the way that we're doing them. And those environmental consequences naturally aren't priced. And I'm not going to go into a long discussion. I guess I'm having lunch with some or all of you, and there will be questions later, and we can talk about kind of capitalism and how that works, and it's all a big, big, big thing. But the fact that when we burn fossil fuels in our campus power plant to provide electricity and heat, it causes climate change, and that isn't priced into our costs of buying the fossil fuel, our costs of burning the fossil fuel, our costs of distributing the electricity, is not because somebody thought that it would be a bad idea to price it. It just sort of naturally happens. It's a natural externality. It's an implication of the way the environment works. So there are a lot of, in fact, I would argue that all environmental problems are externalities, right? Because we started from the premise that nobody's trying to cause them. You're trying to do something else. You're trying to feed your family. You're trying to get your kids to school. You're trying to stay warm. Really all very good goals. And or you're trying to grow your economy and produce sort of manufacturing, whatever it is, there are good things that you're trying to do. You're trying to accomplish important things. But in the course of trying to accomplish important things, you're producing these externalities, and those are causing environmental problems. Now, infrastructure can itself have negative environmental externalities. So when you're thinking about infrastructure, whatever your sector you're working in, think about the good thing that you're trying to accomplish with your infrastructure and what unintended consequences it might have. So they sent speakers in the program a little, I don't know if it's eventually what you ended up getting, but in a list of notes, you were told to think about the sustainability of your infrastructure. And the way that was framed on the piece of paper I was given was thinking about things like how the things that get built will be maintained or replaced over time. And that's important. But I want you to think about the sustainability of your infrastructure also in thinking about what the externalities are of your infrastructure. So if you build pipelines to transport fossil fuels or whatever sort of energy input you're building more easily across the country or across the world, that might be really useful for people that need to be able to warm themselves or provide electricity. But it's also going to make fossil fuels more available, cheaper than they would otherwise be. More of your energy will come to depend on fossil fuels. And in fact, I mentioned the campus power plant. We have a really efficient campus power plant that cogeneration. It sort of takes the waste heat from electricity generation used for heat and cooling. And that's fantastic. That's a really nice piece of infrastructure that we built intending to kind of provide energy in a cost-effective and reasonably environmentally friendly way. But what it does, because we built that power plant, we provide our own electricity, and that power plant is designed to run on fossil fuels. So even though we do it incredibly efficiently, we don't have the ability on campus to provide energy in a way that would be completely renewable or completely non-greenhouse gas emitting. So the infrastructure that we chose, for very good reasons, and in fact even partly for environmental reasons, has environmental impacts overall. If we build roads or railways or anything to get people to where they need to be, right? And important, as I know some of you are looking at transportation, whatever kind of transportation infrastructure you're building is going to have environmental externalities. You're building roads that suddenly make transportation by automobile or other sort of vehicles easier, and therefore you set up a society in which that transportation is assumed. You build roads. I was just in Panama yesterday, and we were talking about an area where people were building roads to get people to a national park. Well, that's great, and the national park is wonderful, and it's this sort of beautifully preserved area to protect wildlife, but you build roads, and A, more people go visit the national park, which has some downsides for the wildlife, but B, you build the roads through these pristine areas that now separate out different sections of the ecosystem, and as you're fragmenting your habitat, you're causing species to be endangered. So even though you're trying to build roads to get people to a place so that they can appreciate the beautiful nature that's being preserved, you're also probably helping to unpreserve the nature. So sometimes those externalities can even be feedback loops. So for instance, flood control has a history of increasing death and damage from floods, not because it doesn't work, but because it does work, because you build infrastructure to make it less likely that an area is going to flood, and that's, again, really important and useful. When the area doesn't flood very often, people now think, oh, it's okay to live there, it's okay to build buildings there, it's okay because it used to flood here all the time, but now it doesn't, this is going to be safe. So when it does flood, there are more people, there's more property. And again, that's an externality, it's sort of a feedback loop externality, but nobody's trying to cause more property damage, more loss of life from flood control. You're in fact trying to cause less, but the infrastructure is itself sort of leading to behavior change. So first thing you always want to be looking for in any kind of policy you're designing, in any sort of infrastructure you're working on, is what are the externalities. And another thing to think about, and I'm actually working on a book that's on this subject, and I decided my next project after that, what comes after that. Another thing to think about is when you think about externalities and about the fact that you might want to change your behavior or change your infrastructure to avoid the externalities, don't think of it as, oh no, she's telling me I shouldn't be driving to campus, which, by the way, I get a lot when I give talks like this. Think about it as, what is the underlying goal that you're trying to create? What are you really trying to do? It's not that I'm trying to drive to campus, it's that I'm trying to get to campus, or I'm trying to be able to give a talk. And think about, are there ways to do that that are going to have fewer externalities or cause fewer environmental problems? So externalities are kind of the key starting point. A second thing to think about is where, both in time and in space, you have your costs and your benefits from what you're doing. And again, for costs and benefits, think really broadly. Don't think kind of economic things that you're paying, but the good things and the bad things. Where do they come in time, and where do they come in space? So if you are undertaking, I don't know, some sort of action, do you change your light bulbs now, and over a really long time you get the benefits of the changed light bulbs? So that's sort of thinking on the positive end. But the other piece is thinking on the behavior that's causing environmental problems in the first place. So if you are heating your classroom now and contributing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, that will cause climate change over a long-term period. Or if any, didn't see if you all have been eating strawberries. If you're eating strawberries, you're depleting the ozone layer. And you're eating your strawberries now, and they're really great strawberries. And the methyl bromide that was used in growing strawberries is applied now, and it makes it easy to grow a beautiful strawberry crop. But in, I don't remember off the top of my head how long methyl bromide lasts in the stratosphere, but I think it's on the order of more than 100 years. For the next, your strawberries this morning will be contributing to ozone depletion for the next 100 or 1,000 years. So the effect is felt very far in the future. Now, that makes it even harder to think, right? That's an externality, but it's an externality that you feel much further away, right? If I, play my guitar in my apartment, my neighbor has the, depending on her perspective, negative or positive externality from my guitar playing. But that's a fairly direct, immediate externality, right? She comes to me and bakes me cookies because she loved them so much, or she bangs on my door and, gets really cranky because she hated it. Either way, it's an externality that's happening now. And an advantage of that, it's still an externality, it's still difficult, it's still unpriced. We still have this reciprocal relationship around this externality, but at least it's happening at the same time. And when we think about trying to address it or prevent it, we're all in the same sort of moment that we can think about that. But if I'm doing something now that's going to affect people 100 years in the future, which means people who don't even exist now, it's a lot harder to think about how to have that relationship between what I'm doing and the people who are being harmed. And so it's much less likely that I'm going to take that into consideration. When I'm about to play my guitar, I notice that my upstairs neighbor has a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And so I think about the time of day because I'm not a jerk, even if it's an unpriced externality. But it's a lot harder to think about the effect that I might be having on some random people who don't exist 100 or 1,000 years in the future. So the further in time your externality happens, the more likely it is to be caused in the first place and the harder it is to think about preventing it. And one of the reasons that's particularly difficult when you think about it from a policy perspective is think about election cycles. If I want to get reelected, I want to provide benefits to my population now. I want to give them beautiful, gleaming plates of strawberries now because they will love me and reelect me. And the fact that people 100 or 1,000 years in the future will be dealing with ozone depletion, that's much less important to me than getting elected because you know what? If I don't get reelected, I can't do anything about these problems. Even if I'm a fundamentally good person, I want to solve these problems. Same thing when you think about anything going on this campus. A college president isn't here for that long. You guys aren't here for that long. You're here even less long than a college president is. Your time horizons are very short. And so it's pretty easy to say, it's really important to my college experience that I do X, even if X turns out to be having long-term environmental implications. I'm really stressed out. I'm teaching in the 3-college Intro to Sustainability course. One of the examples people always came up with was taking long, hot showers. And they would say, I'm just so stressed out in college. The only thing that keeps me unstressed is taking these long, hot showers. Well, fine, that makes, if you can, not only does it make sense, but if taking a long, hot shower is what enables you to get through college, it's a really smart decision on your part, right? That's the thing that's going to get you through that exam, that's going to get you the Wellesley education that you have worked so hard for. Great. The effects of that long hot shower are being felt much, much further away in time and by people other than you. So they're externalities that move in time, and that makes them particularly difficult. Externalities also move in space. Oh, actually, one more comment on time. Time is particularly relevant to infrastructure for that reason, because most infrastructure that you're trying to create, the costs are now, right? If you're going to build a school or a road or a water treatment plant, the costs are going to be felt now. And even if the benefits accrue over a long period of time, and it's a really good thing to do, even economically, even just from a straight-up cost-benefit analysis, it might be very difficult to do that because you have to spend the money now, but you only get the benefits over a very long period of time. And so depending, colleges have budgetary cycles, businesses have budgetary cycles, governments have budget crises, especially ones like ours, periodically, where people say, oh no, we're not going to give the money for that at all, even though we already agreed to do it. So it can be very difficult to have absolutely certain current costs when your benefits are in the future. And that's an issue for any sort of environmental problem, but it's going to be a real problem for creating infrastructure, because you need to figure out, great, this water treatment plant is going to be here for decades, and it's going to provide clean water for people, and that's going to be great for health for people that are living 20 years down the road. But it's going to cost an awful lot of money now. We're going to have to find a way to finance that now. And so that time discontinuity can make things difficult. Distance discontinuities are also important. Many environmental problems, more and more environmental problems, happen or are experienced in a location separate from where they are created. I talked in the Albright event in Beijing this year, where one of the big externalities there is air pollution from coal burning. And again, coal burning, a completely reasonable thing to do if you are China. Coal is cheap and abundant. You have a population that needs to be warmed and sort of provided with energy of a variety of sorts, and you have cheap, abundant coal. Now, some of the externality of that is felt very locally in China. But some of that externality is felt in San Francisco. Acid rain and the various other types of air pollutants that are coming from the coal burning in China are actually felt elsewhere. As I said, if we were providing our electricity in the Midwest here of the United States, it would probably be provided by coal. We're getting acid rain in New England because of coal that's being burned in the Midwest to provide electricity to people in the Midwest. And when you think about, again, externalities are hard enough when they're right here by people who are right sort of experiencing them together. But when you move them either in time or in space, why would you want to spend the money to use a different kind of energy in the US Midwest when the air currents mean that we over here in New England are experiencing that acid rain, and in fact, most of the people where the coal is being burned are not experiencing it, right? Again, when you're sort of trying to make a decision, that's a really obvious choice to make, because you're not experiencing those costs, those problems that come from it. So when you think about externalities, they become harder the farther away the effects are felt in time, and the farther away the effects are felt in distance. Infrastructure can also contribute to the distance issues. If you're, for instance, moving water from one place to another, it might make perfect sense to move water from one place to another because, these folks over here don't have enough fresh water and these folks over here do. But now you're getting the benefit of the fresh water over here, and any of the downsides, the subsidence in land areas or the, saline creep, depending on where you're actually doing your water movement, any of the downsides are being felt in the place that it's coming from. So again, always want to be thinking when you're thinking about externalities, not only what's the externality, what are we trying to do and what are the unintended consequences, but where are they in both time and in space. Related to all of this is uncertainty. The thing about environmental problems in general is that we don't always know all the details about what's happening, why is it happening, how badly is it happening, how many people are going to be affected by it, in what ways. Now, sometimes we don't know the basic scientific background, and until we know at least some of that, it's really difficult to think about how to prevent the problem or how to mitigate the problem. So that's a kind of starting point of a type of uncertainty that needs to be resolved. But if you're uncertain about the costs or the benefits of acting, it can be very difficult to think about how to prevent an environmental problem. So how much will we suffer from the problem? Climate change, I know some of you are focusing on climate change, and it's probably the environmental issue of our era. And although the fossil fuel industry that tries to tell you that we're uncertain about whether climate change is happening is full of nonsense, but there are a lot of very specific details of how much will sea level rise here, what's going to happen to the storminess patterns, is this area going to become wetter or drier? And we have some big scale sorts of predictions, but there's a lot of uncertainty in those predictions, and that can make doing something a lot harder. How much will our efforts to address it cost? As I said, my next big project after this one is going to be looking at the idea that a policy is just a starting point. So once you take an action, once you build a pipeline, once you build a water treatment plant, that's not the final structure. People will change their behavior, things, when one of the issues I worked on was ozone depletion, and when we first started addressing ozone depletion, the substitute chemicals that we used instead of the things that were mostly depleting the ozone layer were really, really expensive. But over time, they actually became a lot less expensive. And one of the reasons they became a lot less expensive is that the world agreed that we were going to phase out the use of these older chemicals. Suddenly there were millions, billions of people in the world using these new technologies, these new chemicals. And you had economies of scale that made producing them cheaper. You had kind of new innovation in ways to deal with the issue. And so I was able to trace even specific exact chemicals that initially were very expensive, but over time became less expensive. So we don't know when we're committing to a course of action how much it's going to cost over time. We also don't know how much not acting is going to cost over time. So that's one of the big battles economists are having about climate change, and they're very these different estimates depend a lot on your initial assumptions, and they depend a lot on kind of how you deal with time. People talk about a discount rate, sort of how you think things will be valued over time. And again, that's something we could talk about later if you're interested. But we may be uncertain about that sort of thing. We may be uncertain about how effective our efforts to address a problem will be. And that includes not only how effective technology will be, but how will behavior change in response to what we're talking about. People are some of the, and how people will behave is one of the sort of biggest uncertainties that's going on here. So what you often have when you're trying to address an environmental problem, and again, something you often see in the case of infrastructure, you have a certain cost in the short run. You are absolutely certain that if you build this water treatment plant, it will cost this much. But you have an uncertain future benefit because you don't know over time how much would access to clean water have cost. Will it be greater or less than it is now? You don't know how people will behave. Will they actually be able to maintain this process? Or will all the money that we spend on the plant, where was I? I don't remember where it was, but I was hearing about a bunch of water treatment, kind of building infrastructure for getting access to clean water. And in some places, the way that they were constructed, the local people simply couldn't maintain them. And so this, it was great for the first year or two, but after that, it wasn't doing any good at providing water. So you don't really know at the beginning. You know that you have to spend X amount to build this process now. But over the long run, will that be essentially amortized over 2 decades, 3 decades, as you get clean water for a really long time? Or will you, suddenly have to build another one a year from now? And actually, that goes back to the idea of externalities as well, because it's really hard the unpriced nature, right? You build a water treatment plant. How much do you benefit from that? Well, you have decreased illness. How do you calculate how much decreased illness would have cost so that you can trade off? You can do it, and people do, and it's a great field to go into. But because a lot of illness isn't priced, right? My family is all now really sick. They never actually go to the hospital. They're not because there probably isn't one in this area. They're not engaging with the medical system. So how much of a benefit is it that we're not getting sick now? And so again, there are whole fields of inquiry that have built up to try to figure out how to estimate those things. And you can do it, but they're not priced. How much is it worth to be in good health for a year? And and there are real controversies about, if you can calculate that by how much you would have earned, a person in a really poor country is worth, that person's year of health is worth less than my year of health when you trade it in terms of how much I would have earned. So it's really difficult, right? And hopefully you all start from the assumption that that's a little problematic. So it's, there's uncertainty about a lot of things as you're trying to figure out whether it makes sense to undertake an action either sort of at the societal level or at the individual level. Okay, another thing that's uncertain is what people will do, which I said in some ways. One of the things that we see with a lot of activities, but because I focus on environmental issues, I'm going to frame it in terms of environmental problems, is what we call collective action problems. So even in circumstances where it would benefit all of us to act collectively. So this is the easy case. This is the case where we would legitimately, each and every one of us, be better off if we could act collectively. We may fail to act collectively. And in fact, there are those who predict that for the most part we will fail to act collectively for completely good reasons. So working together to address a problem you know about and that you will all benefit from cooperating to fix is structurally hard. It's hard for a bunch of reasons that we can understand. The big issue, the big issue is the problem of free riders, which is essentially to say people who don't contribute to doing whatever this collective action is that we're trying to do. So people who listen to public radio without contribute to public radio. People who, actually one of my favorite examples that one of my classes came up with last year, just out of the blue, was building a playground in your neighborhood. People who don't contribute to building the playground in your neighborhood, but nevertheless, once the playground is there, there's a playground in your neighborhood, and so they can use the playground. So if whatever the benefit is that you're trying to create, and all of you this month are trying to create some sort of benefit, if whatever that benefit that you're trying to create is publicly available, everyone can benefit from its provision, even those who don't contribute to making it happen, even those who free ride. And again, there are a lot of good reasons to free ride. Now, one reason to free ride is simply that you have many, many things in your life that you need to do. So, in a hypothetical neighborhood playground example, it would be great if there were a playground in my neighborhood, but I have to, I have a demanding job, and I have a sick kid, and I have, this other political action that I'm contributing to. And so coming to the playground meeting in which we're going to decide how we're going to pitch in money to build the playground, or we're going to pitch in labor to build the playground, I might not go that day. Think about any sort of political action that happens on this campus, and how you might care a lot about this thing that might be happening, but you have an exam to study for, or you have your volunteer work to go do. There are good things that you have to do that are competing for your time, and so you might not go to that meeting. You might not go down to the end of the block and start building the playground. And you might not do that, especially if you know you're going to get the benefit of the outcome. If you're going to be able to get the fresh water that's been created by our drilling a well and kind of making the infrastructure that we need to get access to the fresh water, I'm going to work those extra couple hours because I'm trying to get enough money to send my kid to school, and that's a really important thing to do. And lo and behold, if there's fresh water, I'm going to get access to it anyway. So the possibility of free riders mean that fewer of us are going to contribute than would benefit. And the real problem is that if free rider problems are big enough, you won't get the outcome at all. Right? If we all need to get together to build the school or the playground or the water treatment, the sort of well, the well, and one person shows up to do it, she's not going to be able to do it on her own because the rest of us are free riding. So it's not just that we're free riding, we are actually not successfully free riding. You might not get collective action at all if enough of us don't contribute to making this happen. And again, remember, I start from, there are a few jerks out there in the world who are sort of trying to, get by on what other people are doing. But most of the time when you're free riding because you have legitimately other important priorities in your life. The other reason you might free ride that's sort of related is you're concerned that everybody else is going to free ride and this isn't going to happen. So if I spend my day that I could have been taking care of my sick kid or earning what small salary or collecting the firewood that I need to heat my home, if I spend my time, trying to dig this well, and 2 other people show up and we can't do it, I've doubly lost. I've got what's called the sucker's payoff in game theory because I gave up my advantage and I didn't even manage to create the collective action. So what that means is that any kind of collective good is underprovided. There's less of it than not only sort of we, the academics, standing aside, outside of the situation and saying, boy, wouldn't it be great if there were all this clean water, all these wells dug, if this playground created, this school created. But that the actual people in the situation would like. There's less of those collective goods. Now, a playground is one thing. Environmental resources add a different dimension to collective action that make it even harder. And so I want to talk to you briefly about what I'm going to call issue structure. And the important idea of issue structure is that I will divide the world of issues into 2 categories. Is the issue excludable? Can you keep people from accessing whatever this is that we're talking about? And is it subtractable? So in the case of a playground, a public playground might not naturally be excludable. And that's part of the problem. It's the reason that the people, only a third of the people in my neighborhood come by and pitch in to create the playground because we all know that we can access it. So collective action problems are usually problems of excludability. Some sort of issue that if the water in this lake is clean and everybody can get to it, it's not excludable. Can you keep others from benefiting from it? Now, what's interesting, going back to the playground example, the people who in my class who were talking about playgrounds said, well, one of the ways to make the playground less a collective action problem is to make it excludable. Right? When you make something excludable, you get rid of the problem of free riders. Because if only those who contribute get access, then suddenly if you want access, you have to contribute in order to get access. So it's like the difference between public television and cable television, or public radio and satellite radio. Right? I don't contribute to satellite radio. I don't get to access it. If you haven't given money to the local NPR station, you can still listen to the news. And therefore, you are in fact less likely to listen or to contribute because you can get access to it anyway. So one of the things that you can do to deal with collective action problems is to make something excludable. Couple issues there. One, practically speaking, it may be difficult to make something excludable. So I deal with issues of what I call the global commons, like the atmosphere and the oceans. Turns out you can't really fence the oceans or the atmosphere. So there's some things that it's just very difficult to make excludable. The second thing is a question of ethics, right? So it's one thing to talk about my wealthy neighborhood in the town of Wellesley and whether we're going to create an excludable playground that has a fence around it and you only get a key if you actually contributed to building it. It's a very different thing when we're talking about a well that's providing clean water and to say, well, you can only have access to that if you have contributed to it. That might be a decision that you want to make. But it's a little bit of a harder decision to think about something that is really kind of a key need for people and to say, hey, sorry, you didn't contribute to it, therefore you can't access it. And that's why one of the big controversies when people talk about water is the idea of privatization of water. And is it ethically okay to take something that's a basic need and exclude people from it, right? So conceptually, this is important, and I don't want you to write it off at all because there are a lot of contexts in which it really makes a lot of sense to try to create excludability. But there are some contexts in which it probably doesn't. And then, of course, there are contexts in which you literally can't. There's nothing you can do to make something excludable. But then it gets harder when you talk about subtractability. So subtractability is about whether my use of a resource in whatever way influences the usability of that resource for someone else. So a playground isn't really a subtractable issue. At the margins it is. 50,000 people played on the swings, they would probably break. But for the most part, if a couple of kids are using the playground, it's not going to make it any less useful for the next couple of kids that are going to be using it. But the water, if you take the water, the clean water, there may be less clean water for the next people. I study fisheries, which is a huge problem with subtractability, because any given fish, if I take it out of the water, it's not there anymore for access to for other people or to make baby fish that will have greater access for us in the long run. And the problem with subtractability, when you're dealing with an issue that's subtractable, free rider problems are a lot worse. Because it means, with a playground, okay, so only a third of my neighborhood shows up to make the playground. But they can do it. If they have enough time and enough money and enough energy and enough whatever, they can make the playground. I contribute a whole lot of money to public radio because I really value public radio. A bunch of you probably listen to public radio without contributing, and that works out okay because they're sort of crazy motivated people like me who do that because it's really important to me. So you can have some free riders as long as you have an issue that isn't too subtractable. It doesn't make the public radio any less good if you're listening to it without having paid for it. It doesn't make the playground any less good if, a kid whose parents didn't contribute is playing in the playground. But with the clean water or the fishery, if most of us solve the collective action problem and come up with great rules to protect a fishery, and a few of us don't, those few of us can completely destroy the fishery. So when I mentioned the suckers payoff when it comes to free riders, that's really where the suckers payoff comes out. I want to feed my family, and I recognize that if I can protect the fishery in the long run, it's going to be great. So I'll go through a couple of hard years of lower fish catches because if we can manage the fishery sustainably, it will get bigger and I will be able to catch more in the long run and I'll be able to keep fishing and feeding my family forever. And that's great. Except if Ellen over there starts fishing and, the rest of us are sort of, going through this hardship, but we're in it together, we're going to save the fishery. And Ellen comes in and says, ha, look at them. Look at all these fish. Nobody's taking the fish. Great. Brings her a huge trawl nets, hauls in the fish. And now we've lost twice because we sort of went through the hardship this year of not taking a resource that would have been useful to us. And we don't even get the benefit in the long run of having protected it. So subtractability, which is a problem for almost all environmental resources, is going to make anything that you're trying to do environmentally much more difficult. So all of these things lead us to, this is almost not worth putting on the board because it's so central, or it's so inherent in everything else. But all of this leads us to think about incentives. All of these, I'm calling these mostly structural characteristics of issues, lead the balance to be tilted in favor of doing the wrong environmental thing. That if you're worried, you don't know how much of a problem it's going to be. Or it's going to be a problem, but for people somewhere else in some other time, and all of this is an externality, you are much less likely to want to contribute to the collective action to prevent it from being a problem, or to, get the factories to shut down their polluting on this lake so that we can actually have a clean lake. So part of what this means, and when I call this talk "Why Good People Do Bad Environmental Things," one of the big core central reasons that good people do bad environmental things is that the incentives are all wrong. And some of those incentives are all wrong naturally, right? Most of these things, the fact that things are externalities, where they fall in time and distance, certainly collective action and issue structure, are naturally part of the issues. It's not that somebody set this up wrong. It's that, the deck is stacked against environmental issues to begin with. But it's also true that we then make it worse by some of our decisions. So we create policy decisions, and again, for the most part, Maybe it's just that I'm an optimist. But I like to think that most of the things that we're trying to do come from good motives, right? Agricultural subsidies in this country have huge, huge environmental and social implications that I think on balance are not good. But it's not that somebody said, "Ooh, boy, we're going to screw the environment. Isn't that great? Let's put these subsidies on corn that's going to, get everybody to grow all this commodity corn, and suddenly it's going to become cheap to feed cattle, and beef is going to be really inexpensive and cause all sorts of climate change." And nobody said that. People said, wait a minute, there are some important difficulties that farmers have over time in terms of certainty about wages, and farmers are really important. We want to have farmers in our country. So policy decisions, again, and it's good to start when you're trying to undo a policy decision or try to, I would love to get rid of agricultural subsidies. I would particularly love to get rid of fisheries subsidies because that's an issue I've been working on for a long time. If you go into that thinking, wow, those terrible people, what a stupid policy, this is ridiculous, we should get rid of it, you're going to miss that it's there for a reason. And so a lot of externalities can be from policy too. Right, we want to make income more predictable for farmers. We want to make sure that we have a country where farmers are present. We don't want to move to a country in which we don't grow any of our own food. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to want. But because of how we do that, because of how we happen to have set this up, there are a whole bunch of knock-on effects that incentivize different types of behavior. Right? So even, I'm not a big fan of fossil fuels because I kind of like the global climate in a reasonable shape. And there are a whole bunch of other problems from fossil fuels. But again, making people warm is important. Getting electricity so that we can have an economy that functions is important. Building pipelines to do that makes sense. It just has a whole lot of other externalities. So what we need to be thinking about when we're trying to change a situation, create infrastructure, change policy, make policy, is what are the types of externalities that are going to come from that policy decision. Or when we have a policy decision we don't like, because we don't like the externalities, let's go back and try to figure out, well, what was the thing it was trying to do in the first place? And is that thing still a good thing that we want to do? Is there a different way to make sure that we keep farmers? Is there a different way to, help our poor fishers survive during the years when it's difficult to catch fish? Because the subsidies are causing really bad behavior, but maybe there's a different way to meet that goal. So again, you always want to be looking behind the externality to what are we actually trying to accomplish. And you also want to be remembering that almost nothing that we're doing is because we have bad motives. They're almost always good motives. It may have bad effects, but we need to understand what those motives are in the first place. So to wrap this all up, what can we do now that we think about environmental problems and infrastructure issues in this context? The first thing I would say is to recognize that it's really hard to address and prevent environmental problems. One of the things that has always frustrated me about naive environmentalists is you have very motivated people who, and I can say this because I'm a folk musician, so, but I sometimes use the phrase, who think that all we need to do is hold hands and sing and we'll save the environment. Well, I hold hands and sing a lot. It's kind of what I do. But I don't think that that's actually a very quick route towards protecting the environment. It's really hard to avoid these problems precisely because there are good reasons that people are behaving in these ways. There are good reasons that these policies have been created. There are good reasons that infrastructure was put into place that may have these bad unintended effects, but they're there for good reasons. And so if you want to address these problems, you have to start by figuring out why it is that people are doing what they're doing. Infrastructure plays important roles on both sides of the equation, both in creating environmental externalities. So some of the environmental problems that we have now have been made more prevalent because of infrastructure. And some of the infrastructure, I hope that whatever infrastructure you're considering, you'll at least take a minute with your group and think, okay, what sort of unintended environmental consequences might we have from this? And how can we think about either changing it or putting into place something else that will help mitigate those environmental externalities? But infrastructure can also be a really important way to remedy or avoid environmental problems. Now, it's a lot easier because of collective action problems if you have the ability to go out and kind of impose your infrastructure, right? If somebody else can come in and finance that well or that school, you don't need to worry about the collective action issues of creating it. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work that way that often, and actually, unfortunately, some of the really worst environmental infrastructure was imposed externally. The World Bank, for a long time, went in and made huge dams for, again, good reasons. It's not that the World Bank is evil, and there were perfectly important things that they were trying to accomplish by funding large dams, but they also destroyed cultures, destroyed ecosystems, destroyed communities. And again, it doesn't help to start from, put on your World Bank is evil hat. It helps to start from what were they trying to accomplish with that infrastructure. So on the one hand, it can be handy if you have a sort of well-thinking, centralized actor who can help you avoid collective action problems. On the other hand, sometimes they can get it spectacularly wrong, and that's not necessarily an answer either. So creating good infrastructure can itself be difficult because of all these reasons, because it costs money now and has its benefits in the long run. What those benefits are might be uncertain. Particularly if it's not externally provided, might be subject to collective actions. The incentives might be wrong. So hopefully, even if you're not really focusing on environmental issues, this framework is going to help you think about some of the things that you're dealing with in terms of infrastructure. A few other comments. Really, ultimately, I think you want to fix the incentives to the extent that you can. You want it to be the easier or the less costly thing to do the right environmental thing. But often that requires because environmental issues are externalities, right? If it costs, this is where, again, people on campus hate me when I say things like this. If it costs money to park, if faculty had to pay to park on campus, they would, in the long run, find other ways to get to campus. The incentive structure would change the way they behave. Initially, it would really suck because people, and there are issues of equity. And again, the reason my next book is going to be about what happens after you have the policy, because other things would change socially. But anyway, you really want to address the incentive structures to the extent that you can. Information is important, right? If you've got uncertainty issues, the more you can resolve some of those uncertainties about what's going to happen over the long run, what are the costs really going to be over the long run, or the benefits, that can help. Again, changing the issue structure, can you make something excludable? Practically, ethically? I think that in fact, I've done a lot of work on global shipping, and methods of exclusion are what changed global and sort of environmental, labor, and safety standards on ships. They got really bad for a while, and then they got a lot better. And they did that precisely because of issues of exclusion, a whole bunch of different mechanisms of exclusion. So in some cases, it can be great. It can be a really useful tool. If you can exclude somebody from something they want access to, they can behave better as a condition of that access. But again, you need to think about what it is that you're talking about. Can you ethically exclude somebody from access to fresh water? Probably not. So think about the contexts, the issue structure contexts, and whether it's a reasonable thing to do. The other thing is that I'm talking about individual behavior, social behavior, kind of looking at a distance about how people behave and what we can do about that. And I can say, the incentives are wrong, or this is really hard to do. The one thing that I like about Albright, well, no, there are a million things I like about the Albright Institute. One of the things I like about the Albright Institute is that ultimately getting outside of all of this, getting past a lot of this, requires leadership. It requires people who are willing to say, look, I might not get reelected if I advocate for this policy, but this policy is important enough that I'm going to risk it. And I'm going to do my best to change the conversation so that we provide clean water, even if it's going to be a lot of cost in the short run and the benefit isn't going to be felt until a long time from now. I'm waiting for the politician who will do this on climate change. We haven't gotten there yet, but I am going to take a chance at putting a tax on energy so that we will get the incentives right and change behavior because this issue is important enough. And so even when I tell you that the person on the street or in the Panamanian rainforest where I just was, is behaving in perfectly reasonable ways. It doesn't mean that you can't change the conversation. It doesn't mean that people like you can't advocate for or make something happen that is risky, that is hard, that is outside of this framework, or that changes this framework, and in a way that's ultimately what's needed. So I'm glad you're working on all that. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts? You don't have a name tag, you have a beautiful shiny necklace.
My name's Jenna. Nice to meet you, and thank you for coming today. I was just thinking about how we can move people from a conceptual, oh, okay, that makes sense, to an experiential, understanding of issues pertaining to the environment. Because one thing I was thinking about was that before I came to Wellesley, to be honest, I appreciated the environment in theory. Yes, I grew up spending my time by the ocean, so that was always important to me. But just generally walking around I didn't really get it. And then coming here and being able to walk around Lake Waban and just being able to experience how much peace nature has given to me made me completely change my perspective. And then when I've gone into environments where there's tons of strip malls and no trees anywhere, or the air is really polluted, it just has given me a whole new level of appreciation for environments where the environment is held sacred. So I guess for people who don't have that opportunity and that distance to be able to really see and experience nature, how do you change perspectives, and how do you change the thinking that goes into the decisions that impact our politics, but also just our way of life?
Well, I have two different answers to that question. So I'm actually in the middle of writing a book that has the working title, Why Good People Do Bad Environmental Things. And one of the chapters I've been working on the work that started in December and I'm almost done with, is the chapter on information and education. And one of the things that has been demonstrated, and this is very sad as a college professor to say, is that telling people about why it's important to save the environment fails almost completely. And for very good reasons. In fact, for all of these good reasons, I can tell you that it's really important to save the environment, but if your family is going, boy, look at this fishery is really important, or whales are noble beasts, or whatever I can tell you, if feeding your family depends on acting in a way that's going to harm those resources, I can tell you, not only can I tell you, but you can actually have that value that, oh yes, nature is important, but wow, if I don't let people frack on my land, I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. So you can hold both of those views simultaneously. And so the sort of standard, what people think of education as telling people about how this all works, fails completely to change people's behavior. The one thing that does have an effect is experiencing something. So that when you are actually in your case, sort of experiencing some nature that you see as transformative, that can make a big difference. Also, often, seeing a particularly, dismal environmental condition is much more useful than me standing there and showing you a slideshow about it. It's not going to work. It's only going to work when you're actually there and you're seeing it in some way. So my first answer is whatever sort of experience people can have of either the environment as a positive place or the sort of negative environmental effects, are far more useful than any kind of classroom discussion about it. But the other completely different answer I would tell you is that there are ways in which I would argue it doesn't matter. My brother, who people who've taken 214 with me know, is a very different person than I am. He would, squash the baby whales if he could, and he nature bad, it's all about making money. But because it's all about making money, what you have to do is get the incentive structures right. So if he had to pay per trash bag for the garbage that he threw away, right? I might be able to tell you that, or show you the trash dump and the sort of dangerous conditions or the data or whatever would work to convince you that you should reduce your trash use. But for him, and that might get you to change your behavior. For my brother, he's like, nah, forget it. Those poor people, I don't care about them. My brother's very handy as a sort of foil for my conversations in classes, but he is actually like this. But the economic incentives will make all the difference in the world. And for other people, again, remember, I've already said, you can absolutely value nature and still act in a way that causes environmental damage for all these sorts of reasons. If I can change the structure so that it makes it easier for you to choose the right environmental option, or less costly for you to choose the right environmental option, it doesn't matter what's in your heart. And so, one of the things I like to say is that having a kind of personal environmental transformation is wonderful and important, and there's a lot of what I do because I have this identity as an environmentalist, and I care about nature, and I care about the environment. And for me, that's very important. But that kind of transformation is really hard to create. And when you think about billions of people out there in the world, if I had to save the environment by providing that personal environmental transformation for each of those billions of people, it's a little too slow for my liking, which is why I like incentives and structures and processes so that people don't have to love nature in order to not destroy it. They're not destroying it because it's a lot easier to recycle than it is to find a trash can. In fact, when I was in graduate school, I lived in a co-op that the first meal I ate there, I was at the end of the meal sort of going around. I had gotten rid of my compost there, and I'd gotten rid of the aluminum foil that had been on something here in the recycling area, and I'd gotten rid of, and then I had a piece of paper or something. There was something that I couldn't, I had to throw it away, and it was really hard to find the place to throw it away. And that changed my behavior. Just the fact that it was easier to, in fact, just in Panama, where I was at a field station in Panama this last week, and we all had to do our own dishes, and we had to scrape take the, any food that was left over and put it in the plate for the pigs. And I was determined, because there was sort of a long line to get to the place where you'd scrape your plate for the pigs, and then that would put you at the back of the dishwashing line. Not once during the entire week did I actually have to scrape anything into that plate, because I knew I was going to have to do that, and it was just easier if I made sure that I only took a little bit of food, and then if I wanted more food, I'd go back and take more food, right? Because it was easier for me. It wasn't this great noble, oh my goodness, I'm on this little teeny island off Panama and the resources are really tough, and right, that thought process didn't go through my head, I am ashamed to say. The thought process that went through my head is, it's going to be really annoying if I have to get in that line to scrape, to go over there to scrape my plates for the pigs. It'll be a lot easier if I just take a little bit less food and go back and get more. And so whether or not I cared about the resources, my behavior changed because the incentives were set up right. So again, I'm not downplaying the importance of personal environmental transformation, and there are some ways that it can be possible. I'm just downplaying its efficiency. And from my perspective, I think we got a lot of environmental problems we want to solve a lot faster than personal environmental transformation is going to happen. So I want to get the incentives right. Oh my goodness. Headscarf, orange headscarf person. I can't see your name tags. Actually, I've also discovered that the shorter your name, the more I can see it, because the longer your name, the sort of smaller your print. So if you have a short name, I'm more likely to be able to tell who you are.
Hi, I'm Sabiha. I am from the water group, so it was great listening to the concepts that you had about water. So this this is a question may or may not have a direct answer. So in talking about the dams, it can either be excludable or subtractable depending on which country or which body of water you are part of. But the country, as you said, has good incentives in building the dam. So in terms of reconstructing your ideas of the incentive for the countries or the big companies that are not individuals, how would you go about that? Because it's hard to tell those people, oh, you're fine without it. It's okay. It's not okay to destroy the forest. You'll find without energy or source of agriculture or water. So.
Well, because environmental problems are externalities, and therefore unpriced, and therefore unknown in a way. Something that's priced, when you go to the store and you buy something, and there might be a tax that you have to pay, and right, you know how much money you're paying for this, whether it's the thing and the tax, and you can calculate, does this make sense to do? And so the information that you need for that transaction is there. With environmental issues, and particularly with something like the externalities from dams, that information, because it's an externality, it's not built into the process. And so, what often, when the World Bank was in its era of big dam building, what was known was, like, you could calculate, oh, look at the hydropower we're going to get, or look at the flooding protection we're going to get, and you could calculate that. What you often didn't realize, and the reason that the World Bank got out of the business of building big dams, was that it came to find out what all the other externalities were. It came to find out that the flooding protection was rarely as effective as it was intended to be, that all the fish, you lost the fishery because the fish couldn't get over the fish, even if you build fish ladders, the fish couldn't get over the fish ladders. You came to think about especially in areas where, actual places where people were living were being flooded. Again, how do you calculate that? People weren't thinking about that. And so I actually think the World Bank is a fascinating institution. And one of the things I like about it is that it has really learned over time an awful lot. And same thing, World Bank used to be big into subsidizing fisheries. So it would sort of go into countries and say, look, these, there's a lot of fish around here, and these people are really poor, and so we're going to give them a whole bunch of money to build big, fast boats with fancy technology, and that's going to be great because people are going to catch fish and they're going to get wealthy. Well, it turns out they catch fish, they get wealthy, they deplete the fishery, suddenly they've got big boats that can't do them any good, and they're really poor again. And the World Bank figured that out and stopped doing it. And the same thing with big dam projects. And so one of the things that we know a lot better now over time in various areas is what are the types of effects that are happening. And it's a lot easier to do that at the level of a country or a sort of governmental decision because you can say, look, you might get some hydropower over here, and that's going to be great for this particular sector of society, but here are all these negative effects that are going to happen that are going to be bad for all these other sectors of society. And we now know a lot more about that. And so if we can bring that together, we can balance it off and say, well, maybe there's a different way to provide energy that would be less damaging in these other ways. But where the problem comes in is if it's a big private company, those incentives might be able to balance out if you had enough information at the societal level. But if I'm going to earn a whole lot of money right now, my company is going to earn a whole lot of money right now by building this dam, I don't care if this culture is lost. I don't care if the fishery goes under, because I just care I'm going to get a whole lot of money by providing hydropower. So that's where you need to look at the broader structure of how, who's allowing this company to build this dam here? Is there a way to intervene at a sort of further back level to say, well, how do government decisions get made about what the company is allowed to do? But really, I think one of the nice things about studying the environment in this day and age is we know so much more. And information is really the key to getting behind, to balancing some of these incentives. And they don't balance necessarily for the individual, right? So if I individually am deciding, should I catch this fish or not. I catch this fish, I feed my family, that's great. The fishery gets depleted, the rest of you are out of luck, but I didn't starve this year, and that's nifty. At the individual level, it's very hard to address that. You need to pull back to a level where somebody can be paying attention to the costs and the benefits to different actors within the situation. I'm not going to talk. Oh, it's okay, Sophia.
Thanks so much for being here. It's lovely to see you again. I had a question kind of related because it's about private industry. So there was a case study of a clothing company that wanted to lead a campaign against holiday binge shopping. So they made a poster that said, it was like a picture of one of their clothes, and it said, this season do not buy the shirt. And then what ended up happening was that their sales increased by like 40% or something. So my question was, is there a way for private industries to meaningfully incentivize environmentally good behavior without producing rebound effects?
Is there a way? Yes. Do we know what that way is? And I suspect that the interesting, did the increase in sales happen during the holiday season when they were telling you not to buy the shirt? Probably. And they probably knew that. And that, this was not a campaign out of the goodness of their own heart. This was a campaign, right? If you're a business, no matter how socially responsible you are in your business, you can't continue to be a business if you're not going to make money. So you're going to have to find a way to make money. And that is a really interesting way. And, probably it's the people in this room who, suddenly buy their t-shirts from this company because they're showing some sort of social responsibility. But that's really ultimately a marketing move. Again, there are ways to position yourself to be more appealing to certain sectors of society. There are ways to sort of integrate more environmental stewardship into your behavior and maybe make a lower profit, but sell more to people like us who might be willing to pay a little bit more for something that's environmentally conscious. So there are ways to do that, but the thing you always have to remember with a business is you can't continue to be a business if you can't make money. So it's the context that you're working in, and again, it's why, this is why I study international relations probably, and why I study politics, is that you need to step back beyond the individual, whether it's the individual person or the individual company, to look at the context in which they're operating and what are the incentives in that context. Maybe, in fact, what that business should be doing, if it's producing in a green way, is lobbying, and this was actually some part of my dissertation work, is lobbying to get everybody else regulated so that they have to meet that standard. Because suddenly now you have a competitive advantage because you can already produce in a way that meets this higher standard, and so you'll be sort of right out of the gate when everybody else is still trying to catch up. And so that is actually probably one of the best ways for be green and then try to lobby to have rules that make everybody else have to be green. We probably have time for one more in the blue. That's you.
Thank you so much for the great lecture today. We heard from Professor Goddard yesterday a little bit about game theory and about...
Oh, good. So I'm not your first game theory person.
And about specifically in international relations, and one of the things we realized was transparency and social incentives can be huge. So I'm wondering about possibilities of getting people to be more environmentally conscious, maybe because of some social impact. For example, having to declare how much fossil fuel they burn in their house or something along those lines.
Yes, and that's one of the punchlines that's coming out of this book that I'm writing. I'm very much an incentives person, right? I come from a politics and economics background. I think about incentives. I think incentives are really important. But what also matters and again, when I think about incentives, it's much broader than an economist is referring to when they talk about incentives, because I'm not just talking about the costs. I'm talking about kind of, when I moved to Maine, my first job was at Colby College, and I moved to Maine, and I realized that you could buy a conservation license plate, and it cost more. But everybody noticed what everybody's license plate was. And so it wasn't I donate my time and my energy to all sorts of environmental causes, but I bought a conservation license plate because here I was, the new environmental policy professor. People were going to notice if I didn't have a conservation license plate, right? So again, that wasn't not only was it not an economic incentive for me, it was sort of an anti-economic incentive. It cost me money that I would, my first job, my graduate school loans, whatever, but I did it because of the sort of social, it was important to me to be seen in a particular way socially. An interesting thing, I've been looking at plastic bag, like how to discourage use of disposable bags. Now, if you're an economist, you think that charging people 5 cents to buy a disposable bag that they would use when they're grocery shopping is identical to paying people 5 cents if they bring a bag, right? And just in terms of economic theory, those things should be identical. Behaviorally, they're completely different. So that in places, and in fact, we all live in places where a lot of stores will give us a 5 cent discount if you bring your reusable bag. And, because I'm crazy and have this weird identity, I always bring my disposable bag, and if I forgot, I would sort of go back home and get it, even if it doesn't make economic sense. But that's because it's really central to my identity. But for most people, it turns out they sometimes bring their bags, they sometimes don't. When you flop that and make instead a policy where you have to buy a bag for 5 cents, the number of people that bring reusable bags skyrockets. And it's economically exactly the same, especially when you look at how the prices balance out, because even if you're getting 5 cents back, that 5 cents is sort of being redistributed in the price anyway, so it really is economically identical. Behaviorally, it's completely different. And I argue that in part it's because there's a different social message being sent. Right? The social message that's being sent when you get 5 cents back is, oh, you're a good person, that's great. You're doing a little bit to help, that's wonderful, we'll give you 5 cents. The social message that's being sent when you don't get any bags unless you pay for them is, we don't use disposable bags here. That's not how we work as a society. And that, you can get one if you want, but we're gonna make you pay for it. It's a very different social message. And so I think that even though I think ultimately incentives matter probably more than anything else, I think social norms have their own incentive function, and they have a function that's beyond incentives as well. And so working to create the kind of social norms, both by the policy, in the case of a bag policy, that's a policy decision that's creating that social norm, or communicating that social norm. But also, in Panama, nobody drank out of anything disposable ever. Like, there was nothing available there. It was just a part, and there were good reasons that any trash that we created on this island had to be taken off of this island somewhere to have something done with it. It becomes a norm of the community not to have anything that's disposable. And so, again, that's a whole other talk. Maybe next year's Albright, I'll give you the social norms talk, and you guys will have to ask next year's Albright Fellows. But it absolutely, kind of creating a social environment can be important as well.
So I want to point out that we are especially honored this year to have Professor DeSombre, because she came back from her sabbatical in order to address the group this year. So a special thank you to you.